to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to tell you about a very important topic, namely, the weak point in your opponent's position. That may be the king that's not sufficiently protected by his other pieces, or it may be a pawn that's isolated and is easy to attack, or it may be another misplaced piece of your opponent. We'll see different examples, and hopefully by the end of this lesson, you'll have a better idea what a weakness means in the first place and how to get about it. Here we go in our first example. Well, in this position, there is even material on the board, meaning each side has a queen, a rook, and 5 pawns, in addition to the kings. The big difference is between the two sides that the white king is completely safe, having the 3 pawns guarding it right in front of the castling position. On the other hand, while black has castled and has 2 of his 3 kingside pawns protecting the king, it's missing that middle G pawn. And that gives the opportunity to white to develop a winning attack real quick. In fact, white has 2 equally good moves in this case, which will result after white's second move in exactly the same position. So it's really a matter of taste whether you want to bring your queen to the attack or the rook in this particular position. So I am talking about bringing the queen to g4 check. This does not give black the time to bring his own queen to the rescue of the king. Black has only one legal move, and that is to move the king to the corner. And now white must proceed forcefully, namely by moving the rook to g3, doubling up on the g file. And this immediately threatens with a checkmate on g7. As we can see visually even, the black queen is really far away to help at all in the defense. The only move that can prevent the checkmate immediately on the following move is to bring the rook to g8. Now, white needs to change direction a little bit. The g7 square is protected. Capturing the rook doesn't give much because the black queen will recapture, and after rook takes queen, all white did was exchange the whole bunch of pieces without any gain or potential to checkmate. So let's go back, and here the correct move is moving the queen to d4, and all of a sudden attacking the black king on the longest diagonal, and all black can do is delay the checkmate by 2 more moves with blocking first on f6 and then on g7, and then the checkmate arrives real quick. Let's move on to another situation when the black king is completely safe, and in fact, in this position, black is a pawn ahead. But white can immediately go after black's passed pawn on the queen side. And in fact, white is able to win that pawn real soon. All white needs to do is keep attacking it. Rook f to b1 attacks the pawn. The only way the black rook can defend that is from b8. And then white moves with the second rook to a4, attacking the pawn a second time. As we can see, the black rook, the second black rook, can do nothing as of protecting the pawn. So the only option to try to hang on to that extra pawn is to advance it. But then the rook will still keep attacking it and attacking it. And now black has to give up on that pawn. Let's see another situation where again black has an isolated pawn. An isolated pawn means that the pawn has no little brother on either side of its side, right? So the pawn is on the D file, the neighboring files are the C or the E file, and black has no pawns on either of those files. Another noticeable problem that black has in this position is their knight on h6. Typically, knights on the edge of the boards are out of play. It would be much more desirable to have the knight somewhere like f6 or f5 even. On the other hand, white better hurries up and puts pressure on black, puts pressure on that pawn on d5 before the black knight would get back to action and could be used to defend that pawn on d5. So white immediately attacks the pawn by playing bishop to f3. Black can only protect the pawn with one of the rooks, and then simply white goes after the pawn a second time. And now black has no second piece that can protect the pawn. Let's move on to a rook endgame this time. And here we go with 2 pawns each. Here black's problem is that the king is cut away, meaning that white has a rook on the b file and black with the king cannot cross that file as long as the rook is on the b file. And the reason why that is a serious problem is that the pawn on f5 is easy to attack and black will not have sufficient number of pieces to protect that pawn. So what white should do here, simply go after the target, the pawn that's not even being protected once at this moment. The king is far too far trying to defend it, so only the rook can. And now white simply has the time to walk up with the king and be a second attacker of that pawn on f5. After, for example, king a7, king f4, and on the following move, the rook will capture that pawn on f5. Let's see another example, a bishop endgame this time. Again, we can see the weaknesses in the black position, namely the pawn on e5, and it may be at some point the pawn on h7. Here again is simple. White needs to go and attack the weak point, and the weak point at the moment is the pawn on e5. And again, one of the main causes of trouble for black is that the king is too far away from the pawns on e5 and h7. Therefore, the correct sequence right now is for white to play king f3, and after king b7, simply king e4, attacking the pawn, and after bishop d6. What do you think the move is now for white? Well, the correct move is moving the bishop to g3. And black does not have a second piece that could defend the pawn successfully. Let's move on to our next example. And here we go. This looks like a position that's very drawish, as both sides have even material, and bishop each, and knight each. The 3 pairs of pawns on each side basically are almost symmetrical. So how can either side think of winning this game? Well, here the problem is that the black knight on f6 and the king in the corner are both on the same diagonal. And in this case, black's weakness is the knight on f6. And the winning move is to play bishop d4. Simply go after that knight that now is in a pin. If the king protects the knight, the white knight will simply move to e4 using the pin. And for example, if a counter pin arrives, white would just capture the knight with a check, followed by protecting the knight, and white is a whole piece ahead. On the other hand, if after bishop d4, black would give a check first on d5, with the idea to take away the e4 square from white's knight, white could simply even retreat to g1, and then after the black king protects the knight, then would come knight g4 using the pin. Sadly for black in this situation, the bishop wasn't able to guard both the e4 and g4 squares. And then, depending on which way black goes, white goes the other way and wins that knight on f6. In this unusual looking position, black's big problem is that their queen is all the way stuck in the corner. However, in order to win, white needs to make progress. And the first sign of progress will be if we can trap that black queen on the corner. The good news is it's not running away anywhere, because the black knight on b8 cannot move, and neither can the black pawns. So black pretty much is in a sad situation, can just keep moving his king, while all white needs to do is go and get that queen by playing simply knight f6, aiming to get to the c7 square to attack the black queen. And now, for example, after king g7, knight e8, king f7, and knight c7, trapping the queen, and then white will take advantage of its passed pawn on the h file. Let's move on to our next example. And here we go. In this position, it's quite obvious that the black knight on h5 is out of play. However, the big question is, how can we take advantage of it? Here, white would play immediately attacking that knight before it runs away. And now the knight is trapped. Let's move on. Here we go. Now let's look at this position. We have even material, even though white has a knight versus black's bishop, but they are of the same value. And in this case, at the first sight, it's not quite obvious where is the weakness. However, we'll discover very soon that the black bishop is very, very limited in its movement. And namely, white can trap that black bishop real quick by limiting its mobility to just one square. Of course, if bishop takes the pawn, the rook would take the bishop. Bishop moves to h5, and now white is ready to attack the bishop again by moving simply up the pawn to g4. And black cannot avoid losing material. Let's move on to our next example. And here we go. Here, black is the one having material advantage. However, it's not hard to notice that the black rook on h5 is completely out of play. In fact, that black rook has no moves at the moment. So the most logical thing to do is try to attack the rook. but that move opens up, clears up the h3 square for the rook. What happens if black goes there? One of those situations where even though the black rook is attacking the white knight, and the white knight could capture the pawn on e5, white can do better by simply moving their own king to g2, protecting the knight on one hand, and on the other hand attacking black's rook. And this is called the rook being trapped. And now I would like to go back to some more positions where the target is the king. After all, the king itself, or trying to checkmate the king, is the most important and most dangerous threat we can create for our opponent. Let's move on to the next example, and this is the position. Well, if you look at this position, and the first thing you see is that each side has completely equal material. You can notice each side has the queen, rook, bishops of opposite colors. And if you count the number of pawns for black and white, you will see that they are even as well, 6 each. Well, material is one thing, but then there are weaknesses. And as I mentioned, the worst is to have weaknesses around your own king. Now, on the other hand, if you play with the black pieces in this position, you're in extremely good shape. Black has a very powerful bishop on g7, pasting over that whole long diagonal a1 through h8. And the reason why white is having a weakness and why white is having a problem is because white already has moved the pawn up by 1 square to b3. Also, white does not have a bishop that would move along the dark squares. So therefore, it's very hard to defend those dark squares. White doesn't have any other piece, such as a knight or rook, which could protect the squares around the white king. So it's very important that your eye gets used to things what are considered weak squares. In this case, all these squares around the white king would be considered weak squares. Why? Because if the opponent, especially if the opponent has a queen like they do here, a queen on g5, if that queen would appear on b2 out of all places, or in the corner on a1, if you imagine the black queen being in one of those two squares, the game would be over. White would be checkmated. It's a bit less dangerous if the queen is on a3 or c3 because it's not an immediate checkmate. However, it's pretty bad as well because it would create the threat of a checkmate. So the point is, if you're playing with white, you'd want to avoid situations like white is facing here. If you're black, you want to make sure you take advantage of the opportunity given. So what you'd want to do in a situation like this, you want to have your queen on this key diagonal where you have your bishop already, and preferably in a way that white will not be able to block the way of the queen successfully. So therefore, the most ideal move here for black is to move the queen to the center to e5, creating dual checkmate threats on b2 as well as in the corner on a1. If white would try to block the queen's way, it would not really solve the problem, just delay the end, because the queen would simply capture that pawn and then the threat of queen b2 is still there. In fact, it's undefendable. Let's go back and look at the position after queen e5 again. Let's think from white's perspective for a moment. What other option may white have to prevent the immediate checkmate of queen b2? Well, typically there may be 4 ways to defend against such a threat. One would be to bring another piece and physically protect those squares on b2 and a1, which in this case is completely impossible. A second choice would be to block the queen's way, which we already saw didn't quite work, just gives up a pawn, and then white needs to still deal with the same exact problems. A third option may be if white would have a way to capture the black queen or bishop. But as you can see, we don't have that choice either. So the only option left is try to run away, and let's see what happens when white does that. The king goes to c1, and now if the black queen would move to b2, for the moment being the white king would have an escape. Now black can do better than that here. First of all, black could immediately win a rook by giving a check, which is a skewer, because after the white king moves out, now the black queen can simply capture the rook. But remember, whenever you see a good option, look around and see if you have an even better one. Let's go back to this position after the king moved to c1. Here, objectively, the best move is to move the rook to d8 and cut away the d file, the escape route of the white king, and now white is stuck still with those 2 checkmate threats which white cannot prevent. Let's move on to the next position. Another example where white faces problems with the king. We can see that the white king is on an open file. There are no pawns in front of it defending it. Moreover, black has a rook on the g file, not letting the white king cross that file. Now the problem is that if you could imagine that the rook from f8, while maintaining the other rook on the g file, if that rook from f8 would all of a sudden appear somewhere along the h file, that would be checkmate. And black has a good number of ways to achieve that. For example, moving the rook to f6. And now on the following move, the rook will appear on h6 with an unavoidable checkmate. Another choice would be, in this case, to simply move the rook to g7, the g rook, and then move the other rook to the h8 square. A very typical checkmate pattern, very well worth remembering it. And let's see another example. Here we go. It's black's turn again, and we can see that black has a rather dangerous advanced pawn already on g3, which can be a very important and significant support if the black queen would get around and get toward the h2 square. Imagine the black queen appearing on the highlighted h2 square with the support of the pawn on g3. That would be checkmate. So in a situation like this, it's an absolute priority to get your queen near your opponent's king and try to create that checkmate threat. And the way to achieve that is to bring the queen to d8 with the unavoidable threat of appearing then on h4 and then followed by the checkmate on h2. The white king can try to run, but because of the rooks are in its way, the king really cannot run any further, and The only way white can avoid the immediate checkmate is by giving the rook up, but that of course would mean pawn takes, and the pawn would take the second rook as well, promoting to a queen or rook and checkmating anyway. Let's see another example where black uses a very similar pattern as we saw 2 positions ago. Here we can see the white king seemingly in shape, but black again can use the 2 rooks to create a checkmate pattern. We're using 1 rook to cut the king off on the second rank while creating the checkmate threat with the other rook on d1, against which white cannot defend on the long term. White can delay the checkmate by giving the queen up, but of course that will not change the outcome of the game. Well, thank you for listening. Hope you got some ideas on how to target the weaknesses in your opponent's position. So long until next week.